September 1944. The Spitfire comes in low over Somerset Hills. Engine coughing, tail sections shredded like torn fabric in a gale. Wheels touch grass harder than they should. The fighter skids, yaws left, corrects, then shudders to a stop near the dispersal huts. Ground crew sprints across the field before the propeller stops spinning. The pilot climbs out, shaking. Blood streaks his oxygen mask. His hands won't steady as he tries to light a cigarette. 3 attempts before someone else does it for him. He's 23 years old, and this is the second time this month he's landed with half a rudder missing. One man among the crew doesn't rush toward the cockpit. He walks to the tail, drops to one knee in the wet grass, and traces the burn marks along what remains of the vertical stabilizer. His fingers follow the tear pattern through the fabric covering, mapping where the metal beneath twisted before it gave way. The damage starts aft of the hinge line. Always the same place, always the same progression. He's been watching this happen for months. Some pilots return shaken, some don't return at all. Command calls it combat damage, battle wear, acceptable losses within operational parameters. He knows better, and he's about to break every rule in the manual to prove it. The RAF Culhead sits in the crease of low hills, where morning mist never quite burns off, even in late summer. The cold here is patient, the kind that seeps through leather flight jackets and wool sweaters, and settles into bones and rivets alike. The airfield hums with its own mechanical rhythm. Merlin engines bark to life in staggered intervals across the dispersal area. Ammunition belts clatter through feed mechanisms as armorers load wing-mounted Brownings. High-octane fuel mixed with wet grass and hot engine oil creates a smell that clings to everything, everyone. This is September 1944. The Allies have pushed into France. Paris is liberated. The war is moving east toward Germany, and men speak cautiously of Christmas at home. Maybe next year, if not this one. But the air battle over the Channel remains savage. Focke-Wulf 190s still prowl the coast in hunting packs. Messerschmitt 109s dive from altitude with guns blazing. And Spitfires, sleek and beloved and legendary, are dying in ways that don't make sense. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Hale has flown 32 combat sorties. He's 23 years old. His logbook shows oil stains and T-rings. The pages tell a story of increasing losses. He's buried 3 wingmen in 6 weeks. 2 were shot down cleanly. Cannon fire through the cockpit. Radio calls cut short. Parachutes that never opened. Those deaths made sense in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat. You could see the tracers, hear the impacts, know exactly what killed them. The third haunts him differently. Flying Officer David Pemberton, 20 years old, fresh from advanced training. Hale had been teaching him the fine points of high-deflection shooting, the geometry of pursuit curves, how to lead a target moving at 400 miles per hour while you're pulling 4 Gs in a turn that graze your vision at the edges. They'd been returning from a sweep over the Channel. No enemy contact. Clear skies. Routine flight home. Pemberton called in on the radio, voice steady, reporting all systems normal. Then his Spitfire shuddered, violent enough that Hale saw it from 200 yards away. The tail section flexed wrong. Pemberton's voice came through clipped, confused. Controls are... something's wrong with... The rudder detached, not blown off, not shot away, just separated from the airframe mid-turn as if the metal had decided it no longer wanted to be part of an airplane. The Spitfire entered a flat spin immediately. Pemberton fought it. Hale could see him in the cockpit, hands working stick and throttle, trying every recovery technique they'd drilled. The spin tightened. The aircraft dropped through 3,000 feet in seconds. Pemberton never got out. The Spitfire hit the Channel still spinning. The impact scattered debris across a quarter-mile of gray water. Recovery crews found his body 2 days later, still strapped in. Hale filed a detailed incident report. So did the other pilots who witnessed it. The official response came back within a week, typed on Air Ministry letterhead. Combat stress factors, pilot error during routine maneuver, acceptable loss margins within current operational parameters. Hale read it 3 times, searching for any indication that someone above him in the chain of command had actually listened. The Spitfire was the pride of the RAF. Its reputation was untouchable. Suggesting structural failure felt like questioning whether the sun would rise. whether the king would stand, whether Britain itself could be trusted. But Pemberton's face won't leave Hale's memory. 20 years old. Died screaming into a radio while his controls stopped responding. Killed not by enemy fire, but by something breaking that should never break. On the ground in the maintenance hangar, where daylight filters through oil-streaked windows and the air tastes of solvent and aluminum shavings, one man isn't buying the official line. Sergeant Eric Callaway is 31. Too old for combat, flying by the narrow margins that separate who gets to shoot at Germans from altitude and who keeps the machines alive so others can. Too stubborn for desk duty, too precise in his work to waste on administrative tasks. He spent 12 years as an airframe fitter, most of it on hurricanes during the desperate early days, then Spitfires as the war aged, and aircraft evolved faster than doctrine could track. His hands bear the history of that work. Scars from sheet metal edges that caught skin, calluses from torque wrenches and rivet guns, chemical burns from hydraulic fluid and paint stripper. His coveralls show patches bleached white from solvents, grease stains so old they've become permanent, and the name tape above his left breast pocket stitched with thread that's faded from repeated washing. He doesn't fly the planes. He keeps them alive. There's a difference, and it matters. Lately, he's been keeping count. 9 Spitfires lost in 8 weeks, 4 attributed to enemy fire with witnesses and gun camera footage to confirm, 3 listed as pilot error because the investigation boards couldn't find mechanical cause, and someone has to be blamed. 2 classified as unknown mechanical failure, which is military language for we don't know, and we're not going to spend resources finding out. Callaway has walked through the wreckage of every aircraft that made it back to base damage. He's cataloged fractures and stress points. He's photographed burn patterns that don't match cannon fire or flak. He's measured control surfaces down to the millimeter using calipers so precise they can detect variances invisible to the naked eye. And he's found something no one wants to hear. The rudder assembly is failing. Not from enemy damage, from physics. The Spitfire's rudder is fabric-covered, lightweight, elegant. It's controlled by cables running the length of the fuselage, tension to specifications written when the aircraft first flew in 1938. In level flight at cruising speed, the system is flawless, responsive, predictable, exactly what test pilots reported during trials. In a screaming dive at 400 miles per hour, or a snap turn that loads 4 Gs onto an airframe designed for gentler maneuvers, aerodynamic forces spike beyond original design parameters. The fabric ripples under pressure. The cables stretch microscopic amounts that compound into degrees of control slop. And sometimes, under conditions that Callaway suspects involve specific combinations of speed and G-loading, and possibly air temperature affecting metal flexibility, the rudder tears itself apart. He's written 3 reports documenting this theory, all ignored. He's spoken to squadron engineers. They nodded politely, filed his observations, and continued signing off airframes as airworthy. He requested a meeting with the station engineering officer. Denied. The Spitfire is a proven design. The Spitfire is perfect, and a sergeant with grease under his nails doesn't get to rewrite doctrine handed down from Supermarine's engineering team and validated by thousands of successful combat sorties. So he stops asking permission. Late on a Tuesday night, after the last patrol lands and the crew stumble off to eat lukewarm food and collapse into bunks that smell of sweat and cigarette smoke, Callaway returns to the hangar. He brings a torch, a notebook bound in canvas, and his personal tool roll wrapped in oilcloth. He chooses a Spitfire scheduled for routine inspection. Tail number QVL, pilot, Flight Lieutenant Marcus Hale. The choice is deliberate. Hale flies aggressive, high-speed reversals that make other pilots wince, snap turns that pull the airframe to its limits. If the rudder's going to fail, it'll fail under Hale's hands. If a reinforcement works, it needs to work under the worst conditions imaginable. Callaway doesn't sabotage the aircraft. He reinforces it. Using scrap aluminum salvaged from a hurricane that took flak through the wing and will never fly again, he fabricates a thin brace. 2 pounds of metal shaped with files and hammers over 3 hours in a corner of the workshop where the night supervisor doesn't patrol. The brace is designed to sit flush against the rudder hinge assembly. invisible unless you know exactly where to look. He drills 6 holes, each placement calculated to distribute stress across the hinge without disrupting the control cable geometry or adding drag to the tail section. The math is simple once you understand load vectors and fatigue patterns. The execution requires patience and a steady hand. The installation takes 4 hours. The hangar is cold enough that his breath mists in the torchlight. He works methodically. Drill, deburr, fit, rivet, check alignment. Drill the next hole. The repetitive rhythm of skilled labor, the kind his father taught him in a Coventry workshop before the war, when precision parts for textile looms demanded tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. When he's finished, he steps back and stares at his work under the flicker of a single bulb hanging from the hangar ceiling. The brace is barely visible. From 6 feet away, you'd never know it wasn't original equipment. It's unauthorized, unsanctioned, not documented in any maintenance log or modification bulletin. If it fails and the rudder comes apart in flight, Hale dies and Callaway faces court-martial for criminal negligence. If it works and anyone discovers what he's done, he faces court-martial for unauthorized modification of combat aircraft. He writes nothing down. He tells no one. He walks back to his billet as the first gray light touches the eastern sky and tries to sleep knowing he's just committed career suicide to test a theory. Eric Callaway grew up in Coventry, son of a toolmaker who ran a small shop that produced precision parts for industrial looms. The work required mathematics and patience, tolerances measured in thousandths, metals identified by touch, by the sound they made when struck, by how they responded to files and cutting tools. He learned to read technical drawings before he learned to read maps. He could calculate angles and stress loads while other boys his age struggled with basic geometry. His father's philosophy was simple. Understand what you're making, understand why it matters, and make it right the first time because redoing work is admitting you were sloppy. Callaway joined the RAF in 1932 back when the service was small and most aircraft were biplanes with open cockpits and machine guns synchronized to fire through propeller arcs. He loved the machines more than the missions. He loved the logic of lift and load, the poetry hidden in stress curves and center of gravity calculations. He wasn't romantic about flight. He was religious about function. By 1940, he was a senior airframe fitter at RAF Hornchurch, deep in the chaos of the Battle of Britain. 20-hour shifts patching bullet holes and replacing shattered canopies. Hurricanes landing with wings held together by hope and fabric dope. Pilots climbing out of cockpits streaked with their own blood, asking when the plane would be ready again. He learned something during those months that no manual taught. Aircraft don't fail randomly. They fail predictably. Metal fatigues in patterns. Cables fray at stress points. Rivets crack where loads concentrate. If you pay attention, if you track the wear and listen to complaints pilots are too exhausted to articulate clearly, you can see failure coming. And if you see it coming, you can stop it. But seeing isn't enough. Not in a military machine built on hierarchy and procedure, where innovation from the bottom is tolerated only when it's convenient. A sergeant can suggest, he cannot decide. Callaway learned this in 1942. He identified a fuel line vulnerability in the Hurricane Mark II. 3 cases of post-combat fuel leaks that resulted in cockpit fires. He documented everything, photographs, measurements, a rerouting fix that would take 30 minutes per aircraft and eliminate the problem entirely. His commanding officer thanked him and filed the report in a drawer. 2 weeks later, a hurricane caught fire on the taxiway. The pilot survived with third-degree burns across his face and hands. Callaway's report was never mentioned in the investigation. He learned then that being right isn't enough. Proof isn't enough. You need authority, or you need results so undeniable that authority has no choice but to listen. So when he saw the pattern in the Spitfire rudders, when he measured the cable tensions and found the microscopic cracks and understood what was killing pilots, he didn't write another report. He built a solution quietly, carefully, alone. And now he waits. The problem isn't new. It's just invisible. Spitfires have been in service since 1938. Thousands built. Hundreds lost in combat. The design has been refined through a dozen variants. Engineers at Supermarine ironed out engine cooling issues, fuel tank vulnerabilities. Wing flutter that killed early test pilots. The Spitfire is a known quantity. Its strengths and weaknesses are cataloged in technical manuals that fill file cabinets at every RAF base. But war changes aircraft faster than engineers can track. In 1940, Spitfires flew at 15,000 feet, engaging German bombers in steady, predictable intercepts. Combat meant positioning yourself correctly, firing a burst, breaking away. Maneuvers were deliberate. Physics was forgiving at those speeds and altitudes. By 1944, the missions have evolved. Spitfires hunt fighter bombers at wave-top height, where one mistake means hitting water at 300 miles per hour. They climb to 30,000 feet in minutes, engines screaming, airframes shaking. They dive back down in pursuit of jets the Germans are testing, aircraft so fast that catching them requires pushing every component to its absolute limit. The combat profile has shifted. The stresses have multiplied, and the airframe, unchanged in certain critical ways, is beginning to fracture. The rudder problem doesn't announce itself. There's no catastrophic snap, no sudden explosion that makes investigation easy. Just gradual, invisible degradation. Cables stretch a few millimeters. Fabric wrinkles under repeated loading. Hinges flex microscopically out of tolerance. Then, in the middle of a hard turn at 400 miles per hour, the rudder shudders. Sometimes it recovers. Sometimes it doesn't. Pilots report mushy controls, sluggish response, a weird flutter on the tail section that comes and goes. None of it is specific enough to ground an aircraft. None of it matches known failure modes documented in the maintenance manuals. So the reports are logged and dismissed as pilot sensitivity or minor wear within acceptable parameters. Engineering Command has bigger concerns. Jet engines are being tested at secret facilities. Rocket-assisted fighters are in development. Germany is producing weapons that change the equations of aerial combat weekly. Resources are finite. A vague complaint about rudder, feel from pilots who are exhausted and probably exaggerating, doesn't justify a fleet-wide inspection that would ground squadrons and cost thousands of man-hours. But Callaway isn't working from pilot reports. He's working from wreckage. He's pulled fabric from 3 separate rudders and examined the material under magnification. The tiers always start in the same location, aft of the hinge line where aerodynamic pressure peaks during yaw. The fabric shows stress patterns that match repeated loading cycles, not battle damage or impact. He's measured cable tension on a dozen aircraft using a spring scale calibrated in his workshop. The variances are troubling. Some cables are over-tensioned, pulling the rudder into a slight deflection even when centered. Others are under-tension, allowing slop in the control linkage. None are consistent with the specifications written in the maintenance manual. He's found microscopic cracks in 2 rudder hinge brackets, invisible to the naked eye, detectable only with a jeweler's loupe and good light positioned at exactly the right angle. The cracks follow the grain of the aluminum, branching like tree roots growing through soil. They're early-stage stress fractures. In another 20 flight hours, they'll propagate deeper. Eventually, the bracket will fail, and the rudder will separate from the airframe mid-flight. He brought this evidence to his flight sergeant 3 weeks ago, laid out the fabric samples on a workbench, showed him the photographs of the cracks, explained the pattern. The sergeant looked at the material and shrugged. Wear and tear. Combat is hard on airframes. Log it and move on. Callaway insisted the pattern was too consistent to be random wear. The sergeant told him to write it up if he felt that strongly about it. Callaway brought it to the station engineering officer the following week. The SEO was a career officer, Cambridge educated, polite in the way men are when they're listening but not hearing. He examined the evidence Callaway presented. He asked a few questions about measurement methodology. Then he thanked Callaway for his diligence. The SEO reminded him that Supermarine employed a team of world-class engineers. If there was a systemic issue with the Spitfire's rudder assembly, men with university degrees and decades of experience would have identified it. The aircraft had been in combat service for 6 years, thousands of sorties. Any design flaw would have manifested long before now. Callaway asked if anyone had contacted Supermarine about the pattern he documented. The SEO said that wasn't Callaway's concern. Callaway asked if he could formally request a technical inquiry. The SEO said no, such requests came from commissioned officers, not enlisted personnel. Callaway asked what it would take to get someone with authority to pay attention. The SEO looked at him with eyes that had seen too many requests like this, too many sergeants convinced they discovered something important that turned out to be nothing. His voice was tired when he answered, "A pile of dead pilots. And even then, maybe not." So Callaway returned to the hangar that night and made his choice. He didn't expect to save everyone. He expected to prove a point. If the brace worked, if Hale's Spitfire came back intact after the kind of flying that had killed Pemberton, then Callaway would have evidence. Not a report, not a theory. A living, flying, measurable result. And maybe that would be enough to force a conversation. 2 days after he installed the brace, the station engineering officer conducted a surprise inspection. Callaway was working on a different aircraft when he saw the SEO enter the hangar mid-morning. The officer had a clipboard and a junior engineer in tow, both of them walking the flight line checking maintenance logs and airframe records. This wasn't unusual. Random inspections kept crews honest, caught problems before they became incidents. But Callaway's pulse hammered when he realized which section they were inspecting. He tried to keep working. Focus on the task in front of him, replacing a hydraulic line on a Spitfire that had developed a slow leak. But his peripheral vision tracked the SEO's progress across the hangar floor. 3 aircraft inspected. 4. Moving methodically down the line. The SEO stopped at QVL, Hale's aircraft, the one Callaway had modified. Callaway's hands kept moving through muscle memory while his mind calculated distances. 30 feet away, too far to intervene without making it obvious. Close enough to hear if questions were asked. The SEO ran his hand along the fuselage, checking for skin wrinkles that might indicate internal frame damage. He crouched by the tail section, examined the rudder hinge. His fingers traced the fabric covering. Callaway felt his chest tighten. The brace was hidden, but the SEO knew his job. If he looked closely enough, if he measured the hinge assembly dimensions, if he compared them to the specifications, the SEO stood, made a note on his clipboard, moved to the next aircraft in line. Callaway exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking. He clenched them until they steadied. That afternoon, a runner found him in the machine shop and said the station engineering officer wanted to see him immediately. The engineering office occupied a corner of the administrative building that had been a farmhouse before the war. The desk was cluttered with technical manuals, requisition forms, and hand-drawn modification sketches. The SEO sat behind it looking not angry, but disappointed, which was somehow worse. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He'd heard rumors, he said, talk circulating among the ground crews, whispers about unauthorized modifications, freelance engineering being conducted after hours. He didn't name names, but the hangar was small. Everyone knew who worked late and who didn't. Everyone knew who had the skills to fabricate custom parts and the obsession to do it without approval. The SEO said he understood the impulse. Callaway's dedication to the aircraft was noted and appreciated, but the Royal Air Force operated on standards, not intuition. Every modification had to be tested, documented, and approved through proper channels. The process existed for reasons. Deviation from protocol endangered pilots by introducing unknown variables into combat aircraft. It compromised airworthiness. It undermined the chain of command that kept hundreds of aircraft and thousands of personnel functioning as a coordinated force. He looked directly at Callaway and spoke slowly, clearly, leaving no room for interpretation. No further unauthorized work was to be performed on any aircraft. Period. If Callaway had concerns about airframe integrity, he was to submit them through proper channels, regardless of previous outcomes. If he couldn't trust the system to handle those concerns appropriately, he was free to request a transfer to another station. The SEO asked if this was understood. Callaway said, "Yes, sir." The SEO told him he was dismissed. Callaway walked back to the hangar. He didn't remove the brace from QVL. He simply stopped planning to install new ones on other aircraft. He'd made his gamble. Now he had to wait and see if it paid off. 3 days later, Flight Lieutenant Marcus Hale led a 4-plane patrol over the channel. The mission brief called it routine. Escort a reconnaissance mosquito photographing German coastal installations, watch for enemy fighters, return before dark. Weather was poor, low clouds from horizon to horizon, intermittent rain that reduced visibility to 2 miles. The kind of conditions that made navigation difficult and combat dangerous because you couldn't see threats until they were on top of you. 20 minutes into the patrol, radar operators at the coastal stations picked up contacts inbound from the east. 4 bogies, possibly Focke-Wulf 190s based on speed and formation. Hale's section broke from the Mosquito escort and climbed to intercept. They found the enemy at 12,000 feet just below the cloud deck. 4 190s flying loose and fast. Not the tight formations the Germans used early in the war, but the fluid tactics they'd adopted as experienced pilots became scarce, and survival mattered more than doctrine. Hale called the bouncing dove. The first pass was clean. He lined up on the lead 190 and fired a 2-second burst. Cannon rounds walked across the Germans' wing route. Metal peeled away. The 190 rolled hard and vanished into cloud-trailing smoke. Hale's wingman called a break. 2 more 190s were swinging around for a head-on pass. Hale pulled into a vertical climb, rolled inverted at the top, and came down behind them. His Spitfires shuddered under the G-loading. The airframe groaned in ways you learned to ignore if you wanted to survive more than a few missions. He snap-rolled into firing position. 420 miles per hour. 5 Gs pulling blood toward his boots and graying his vision at the edges. He yanked the stick and stamped full rudder to tighten the turn. The Spitfire yawed hard. The rudder bit into the slipstream like a knife cutting through resistance. The response felt different, sharper than usual, cleaner. The kind of difference you notice when you've flown the same aircraft enough times to know its personality, its quirks, the exact amount of control input needed to achieve a specific result. Hale didn't have time to analyze it. He fired, missed. The 190 broke left. Hale followed, staying locked in the turn. 2 complete circles, both aircraft bleeding energy and altitude. He got hits on the second pass, saw smoke, saw pieces come off. The German dove for the deck. Hale let him go. Fuel state was getting low. The rest of his section was scattered across 20 miles of gray sky and gray water. He called them back into formation and turned for home. During the flight back, he noticed something. The rudder felt solid. No mushiness in the controls. No flutter that came and went depending on airspeed and altitude. Just crisp, immediate response every time he touched the pedals. He didn't think much of it. He was tired. Adrenaline was fading, leaving him hollow and shaky the way it always did after combat. His hands tingled from gripping the stick too hard during the engagement. Every muscle ached from sustained G-loading. He landed, shut down the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. Ground crew was already swarming the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming for the next sortie. Callaway was waiting by the wingtip. He didn't say anything, just walked a slow circle around the tail section, inspecting the rudder, kneeling by the hinge, running his fingers along the fabric, checking cable tension by feel. Hale watched him, confused. The flight had been successful, no damage taken. Why the intense focus on the tail assembly? Callaway looked up and their eyes met. He told Hale the plane flew well. Hale said it flew perfect. Callaway nodded slowly, then walked away without another word. Hale stood there watching him go, trying to understand what had just happened. Why was Callaway so interested in the rudder? Why did it feel like the sergeant was checking something specific rather than conducting a routine post-flight inspection? And why, now that Hale thought about it, had the controls felt different during that high G turn? Tighter? More responsive? Or was that just imagination, his mind inventing patterns where none existed? He filed the questions away and went to debrief with the intelligence officer. But the questions didn't disappear. They sat in the back of his mind, waiting. Over the next 2 weeks, Hale flew 6 more sorties. High-speed intercepts that pushed the Spitfire to its limits. Low-level sweeps along the French coast where every second mattered, and mistakes meant dying fast. Each mission demanded aggressive flying, the kind that made other pilots nervous to fly on your wing because you pushed too hard, turned too tight, stayed in the fight too long. Every flight, the rudder held. Every time Hale stamped the pedals through a snap turn or a defensive brake, the response was instant and solid. He started paying attention to it consciously, testing the controls. Noting how they felt compared to other Spitfires he'd flown. Something was different about QVL. He couldn't identify what, but the difference was real. and Callaway continued to watch. Every pre-flight check, Hale caught him observing from across the hangar. Every landing, Callaway was there first, inspecting the tail section before anyone else could. The attention was too focused to be routine maintenance. Hale began to suspect that his aircraft had been modified somehow. But modified how? And why wouldn't anyone tell him? The question remained unasked because other pilots weren't so fortunate. October 3rd, a Spitfire from 234 Squadron lost its rudder during a dogfight over the channel. The pilot's name was Flight Officer David Mitchell, 21 years old, 3 months out of advanced training. The kind of pilot who studied every engagement brief and asked questions until he understood every tactical nuance. His rudder came apart at 8,000 feet during a high G turn chasing a Messerschmitt 109. Witnesses said the aircraft entered a flat spin immediately. Mitchell's radio call was captured by the sector controller. "Controls gone, I can't pull out, can't." Transmission ended. The Spitfire impacted the water still spinning. Recovery crews found debris but never located the body. Callaway heard the news in the hangar mid-afternoon. He stopped working, walked outside, stood in the rain for 5 minutes, staring at nothing. Then he returned to QVL, placed his hand on the rudder and thought, One more I couldn't save because they wouldn't listen." October 7th, another incident. Spitfire from 501 Squadron returning from a sweep. Pilot named Squadron Leader Thomas Garrett, 28, experience known for smooth flying and good judgment. He reported rudder flutter increasing through the flight. By the time he reached the coast, the fabric was shredding. He radioed that he was losing control authority. He attempted an emergency landing in a field outside Portsmouth, gear up in soft mud. The aircraft broke apart on impact, but the cockpit section remained intact. Garrett walked away shaking, telling investigators that 1 second the controls were there, and the next they just weren't, like someone had cut the cables. October 9th, Hale's wingman, Flying Officer James Rutherford, reported severe rudder flutter during combat maneuvering. He broke off the engagement and limped home nursing the controls. Post-flight inspection revealed cable tension 15% outside specifications and fabric showing stress tears that would have propagated into complete failure within another flight hour or two. 3 incidents in 1 week, all rudder-related. The pattern was too obvious to ignore anymore. Wing Commander Harold Briggs was 37, veteran of the Battle of Britain, with 47 confirmed victories. He'd commanded the squadron for 8 months. He was known for listening to ground crews, for trusting men who worked with their hands, for understanding that the machine matters as much as the pilot who flies it. He called an emergency engineering meeting, reviewed every loss and incident report from the past 6 weeks. The pattern was undeniable. 1 fatality, 2 severe incidents requiring emergency landings, 4 minor complaints logged. Every single one involved rudder problems. Briggs looked at the assembled officers and said what everyone was thinking. This isn't coincidence. This isn't combat damage. What the hell is happening to our Spitfires? He ordered an immediate fleet inspection. Every aircraft, full structural examination, cable tensions measured, fabric inspected, hinges checked for wear. He wanted answers by end of day tomorrow. The order went out at dawn on October 10th. Engineers swarmed the flight line. Aircraft were pulled from the patrol roster. Missions were canceled. The inspection was comprehensive and thorough, and exactly what Callaway had been requesting for 3 months. Callaway was assigned to the inspection team. He worked alongside men who dismissed his concerns, checking the aircraft he'd tried to warn them about. The irony tasted bitter, but he kept his mouth shut and did the work. By noon, they'd found problems. 11 aircraft showed issues, 7 with cable tension variances outside acceptable parameters, 4 with hinge wear beyond recommended service limits, 3 with fabric delamination that hadn't been caught during routine pre-flight checks, 2 with microscopic cracks in the hinge brackets, exactly like the ones Callaway had documented weeks ago. The aircraft were grounded pending repairs, 11 Spitfires, nearly half the squadron's operational strength, gone until the problems could be fixed. Except one. QVL passed inspection flawlessly, every measurement perfect, cable tension dead center of specifications, hinge play within 1,000th of an inch of optimal, fabric condition pristine. The inspecting engineer spent extra time on it, checking and rechecking because the tolerances were too tight. Aircraft with this many flight hours shouldn't be this perfect. He made a note in his report. Airframe condition exceptional. Investigating maintenance protocols for potential fleet-wide implementation. And then he called Callaway over and asked him directly, "You maintain this aircraft?" Callaway said, "Yes, sir." The engineer asked how he kept tolerances this precise. Callaway's answer was careful, measured, exactly truthful, without revealing what mattered. Attention to detail, regular inspections, immediate correction of any variance. The engineer stared at him for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then he wrote another note and moved to the next aircraft in line. Callaway walked away knowing his secret was hanging by a thread. Wing Commander Briggs received the inspection report in his office 3 hours after the last aircraft was cleared. 11 Spitfires with documented rudder problems. One aircraft with tolerances tighter than factory specifications. The disparity was mathematically improbable unless someone was doing something different with that particular airframe. He summoned Callaway at 1600 hours. No warning, no explanation. Just a runner appearing in the hangar with instructions to report immediately. Callaway walked across the field knowing exactly what was coming. The question was how much Briggs suspected versus how much he could prove. There was a difference, and that difference might be the space Callaway could maneuver in or the trap that would close around him. The office was small, a desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets along one wall, a window overlooking the dispersal area where Spitfires sat in their revetments waiting for the next scramble order. Briggs stood with his back to the window, silhouetted against gray afternoon light. He gestured to a chair. Callaway sat. Briggs remained standing. That was tactical. Height advantage. Psychological pressure. Callaway had seen the technique before in disciplinary proceedings. Briggs opened a folder on his desk. The inspection report. He paged through it slowly, letting silence build. Then he looked up and spoke with the directness of a man who'd survived 4 years of war by cutting through bullshit. 11 aircraft with problems. 1 aircraft perfect. Your aircraft. Explain that. Callaway had rehearsed several responses. Technical answers about maintenance procedures. Evasive explanations about luck and careful work. But sitting in this office with Briggs staring at him, he realized evasion wouldn't work. The wing commander knew aircraft. He'd flown them, maintained them, commanded men who died in them. He understood the difference between good maintenance and statistical impossibility. Callaway's answer was careful. Proper attention to detail, sir. Regular inspections catch problems before they compound. Briggs closed the folder. He leaned forward, hands flat on the desk. His voice dropped lower, harder. "I've been flying 6 years. I know when something doesn't add up. QVL has 147 flight hours this month. Heavy combat use. High G maneuvers that should show cumulative stress. It should have cable stretch. It should have fabric wear. It doesn't. Why? Because I maintained it correctly, sir." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Don't bullshit me, Sergeant. Crawford thinks you've done something to that plane. He can't prove it yet, but he will. So I'm asking you directly, and I want a direct answer. Have you modified that aircraft in any unauthorized way?" The moment crystallized. Callaway could lie, deny everything, force them to find proof that might not exist if he removed the brace tonight. But lying meant more pilots would die while bureaucracy processed his reports through channels that had already failed 3 times. He chose truth. "Yes, sir. I modified the rudder assembly." The admission hung in the air like cordite smoke after a firing range goes silent. Briggs didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Callaway with an expression somewhere between disbelief and calculation. "Explain. Everything." "Now," Callaway explained. He pulled his notebook from his coverall pocket and laid out 3 months of documentation. Measurements from 11 rudder assemblies, photographs of fabric stress patterns, calculations showing how aerodynamic loading at high speed exceeded original design parameters. References to loss reports that documented the pattern. He described his 3 ignored reports, the meetings with engineers who dismissed his concerns, the bureaucratic wall that treated him like an obsessive enlisted man who didn't understand his place. Then he explained the solution. A reinforcement brace fabricated from scrap aluminum. 2 pounds of metal shaped and positioned to distribute stress across the hinge assembly without adding drag or disrupting control geometry. 6 rivets placed precisely where load calculations indicated maximum benefit. He'd installed it on QVL as a test. 1 aircraft, Hale's aircraft, chosen deliberately because Hale flew aggressively, and if the modification was going to fail, it would fail under worst-case conditions. But it hadn't failed. 147 flight hours, including heavy combat, and the rudder performed flawlessly. Briggs listened without interruption. When Callaway finished, the wing commander walked to the window and stared out at the flight line for 30 seconds. Then he turned back and his voice was cold. "You installed an unauthorized modification on a combat aircraft without approval, testing, or documentation?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand that's a court-martial offense?" "Yes, sir." "Did you modify any other aircraft?" "No, sir. Just QVL. I needed proof it would work before..." "Before what? Before you took it to command? Before you modified the entire fleet on your own authority?" Callaway met his eyes directly. "Before more pilots died, sir." Silence. Briggs stared at him. The calculation was visible on the wing commander's face. By regulation, this was straightforward. Unauthorized modification of combat aircraft merited court-martial regardless of outcome. But the outcome mattered. 11 aircraft with problems, 1 aircraft that worked. Mitchell dead. Garrett barely alive. Rutherford lucky. Briggs' next words came slowly. Each one waited. "You're telling me that a sergeant with no engineering degree identified a structural failure mode that Supermarine's design team missed, then fabricated a field modification that solved the problem, and installed it secretly on 1 aircraft to test your theory?" "That's correct, sir. And if you'd been wrong, if the brace had failed catastrophically during combat, then Flight Lieutenant Hale would be dead and I'd be facing murder charges along with the court-martial." Briggs absorbed that. He returned to his desk, sat down, and opened the folder again, studied the inspection report with new context. Then he looked up. "I should have you arrested right now. Confined pending investigation." "Yes, sir, you should. But 11 aircraft are grounded with the same problem you identified. We're down nearly half our operational strength, and I need to know if your solution actually works or if QVL passing inspection was coincidence." "It works, sir. The physics are sound. Prove it." "You have 24 hours to provide technical documentation that demonstrates this modification is safe and effective. Drawings, calculations, everything. If you can't, or if your work doesn't hold up to engineering scrutiny, I'll have you arrested and charged. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Dismissed. Callaway stood. He reached the door before Briggs spoke again. "Sergeant, one more thing. If this works, if your modification is validated, you saved lives. But you still broke every regulation we have. Those 2 facts exist simultaneously. Remember that." "I won't forget, sir." Callaway spent that night in the machine shop producing documentation he should have created 3 months ago. Technical drawings of the brace showing dimensions and placement, stress calculations demonstrating load distribution, comparative analysis of standard rudder assembly versus reinforced version. He worked with precision born from exhaustion and stakes that had escalated beyond his control. At 600 hours, he delivered the package to Briggs's office. 40 pages of engineering documentation produced by a man with no formal degree, but 12 years of learning what breaks and why. Briggs forwarded it to Flight Lieutenant Donald Crawford, RAF Engineering Branch, with orders to conduct detailed analysis and provide assessment by 1800 hours. Crawford was 42, career officer who'd spent 20 years maintaining aircraft before the war created demand for his expertise in command positions. He had a degree from Imperial College London and skepticism earned from seeing too many field modifications that looked clever until they killed someone. He took the documentation to a quiet corner of the engineering office and started reading. 2 hours later, he called in 2 junior engineers and told them to verify every calculation Callaway had made. They worked through the afternoon checking math, running stress simulations, comparing Callaway's design against standard Spitfire specifications. The numbers held. More than held. The reinforcement brace addressed the exact failure mode they'd identified during the fleet inspection. It distributed peak loads across a wider structural area, reducing stress concentration that led to crack propagation. The weight penalty was negligible. The aerodynamic impact was zero. Crawford walked out to the hangar at 1400 hours and found Callaway working on one of the grounded aircraft, replacing worn cables. He told Callaway to follow him. They went to where QVL sat in its revetment. Crawford brought calipers and a notepad. He spent 90 minutes examining the brace installation, measured rivet placement down to the millimeter, checked for stress concentration around the fastener holes, assessed how the brace interfaced with existing structure. He was looking for flaws, for evidence of hasty work or inadequate engineering. He found none. The installation was precise, professional, the kind of work that came from someone who understood tolerances mattered and shortcuts killed people. Crawford stood back and stared at the tail section. Then he turned to Callaway. "Where did you learn structural engineering?" "I didn't, sir. I learned what breaks and why. This shouldn't work as well as it does. The design is too refined for field fabrication. You should have made mistakes." "I couldn't afford mistakes, sir. If it failed, people died." Crawford made final notes in his pad. Then he went to brief Briggs. The meeting took place at 1730 hours in Briggs's office. Crawford brought his full analysis. His verbal summary was direct. The modification is structurally sound. More than sound. It's an elegant solution to a problem we should have identified through normal inspection procedures, but didn't. Sergeant Callaway's stress calculations are accurate. His installation technique meets or exceeds standard RAF quality requirements. Briggs leaned back in his chair. "So you're saying it works?" "I'm saying it works better than the original design for current operational profiles. The Spitfire rudder assembly was optimized for combat conditions in 1938. By 1944, we're flying the aircraft harder than original specifications anticipated. Callaway recognized that. We didn't." Crawford paused, choosing his next words carefully. "However, and this is critical, the modification was implemented in direct violation of every protocol we have. If every fitter started making unsanctioned changes based on personal judgment, we'd have chaos. Aircraft would become unique instead of standardized. Maintenance would become impossible. Safety would be compromised. There's a reason we have procedures, sir." Briggs understood the paradox. Callaway was right to identify the problem and right about the solution, but wrong to bypass the system. Both things were true simultaneously and couldn't be reconciled through regulation. "What's your recommendation, Crawford?" "My recommendation is that we validate the modification through controlled testing, submit technical documentation to Supermarine for official review, and implement it fleet-wide only after receiving proper authorization. That process will take 6 to 8 weeks minimum. How many more rudder failures do you estimate in 6 to 8 weeks?" Crawford's jaw tightened. "Based on current incident rate, 4 to 6 significant failures, possibly 2 fatalities." Briggs stood and walked to the window. Dusk was settling over the airfield. Ground crews were preparing aircraft for tomorrow's dawn patrol. Mechanics swarming over engines and airframes, keeping the machines alive for one more sortie. The entire operation depended on those men doing their jobs within the system that governed them. But the system was wrong. The procedures that were supposed to prevent disasters had failed to catch a problem that was killing pilots. A sergeant with grease under his nails had seen what university-educated engineers missed. Briggs made his decision. "I'm authorizing immediate implementation. Every Spitfire in this squadron gets the modification. Sergeant Callaway will train a team of fitters to install it correctly. I want it done within 1 week." Crawford's voice carried warning. "Sir, this sets a dangerous precedent. If you authorize unauthorized work after the fact, you're telling every enlisted man that regulation is optional if they think they're right. I'm telling them that results matter more than procedure when lives are at stake. If Supermarine objects, they can explain why their design is killing pilots and why we should have waited 2 months for permission to fix it. What about Callaway? He still violated direct orders from the station engineering officer. Court-martial proceedings? We'll wait until the modification is installed and validated. If it works fleet-wide the way it worked on QVL, I'll argue for leniency. If it doesn't, he'll face full charges. Either way, we're not losing more pilots to a problem we can solve right now." Crawford knew when argument was futile. "Yes, sir. I'll provide technical supervision for the installation program. Do that. And Crawford, document everything. When this goes up the chain, I want proof that we made the best decision with the information we had. Understood, sir. Briggs called Callaway back to his office at 1900 hours. The sergeant arrived expecting arrest. Instead, Briggs told him he had authorization to modify every operational Spitfire in the squadron. 7 days, 18 aircraft. He could select 3 fitters to assist. Briggs would provide materials and clear maintenance schedules to create time. Callaway's relief lasted approximately 5 seconds before reality set in. 18 aircraft. Complex modification requiring precision placement of 6 rivets per installation. 4 hours per aircraft minimum if everything went perfectly. 72 man-hours of work compressed into 7 days while teaching 3 fitters who'd never done this before and ensuring quality control on every installation, because one mistake would validate every criticism of unauthorized field modifications. He chose his team carefully. Senior aircraftman Peter Davies, 34, former machinist who understood tolerances. Leading aircraftman Thomas Winters, 28, steady hands and attention to detail. Aircraftman First Class Robert Harper, 22, less experienced but willing to learn and take instruction. Callaway spent the first evening training them. He fabricated a practice brace using scrap material and demonstrated proper technique on a damaged rudder assembly pulled from salvage. Drill placement, rivet installation, quality verification. He emphasized that speed didn't matter. Precision mattered. One poorly placed rivet could create a stress concentration worse than the original problem. They started work on October 13th at 0600 hours. The first aircraft took 6 hours because everyone was learning. The brace had to be fabricated from hurricane scrap aluminum. Each piece shaped by hand, filed to exact dimensions, test fitted before drilling. The installation required removing the rudder, accessing the hinge assembly, placing the brace, drilling through both brace and original structure simultaneously to ensure alignment, then riveting with exactly the right amount of force. Too much and you'd distort the metal. Too little and the rivet wouldn't seat properly. Davies was good. His machining background translated directly to this work. After the first installation, he understood the tolerances required and could fabricate braces that needed minimal adjustment. Winters was adequate. He followed instructions precisely, but lacked intuition for the work. Callaway had to check every step, but once Winters understood a process, he replicated it consistently. Harper struggled. His hands weren't steady enough for the fine work. After the second aircraft, Callaway quietly reassigned him to preparing materials and assisting rather than performing critical installations. They completed 2 aircraft the first day, 3 on the second day as efficiency improved, 4 on the third day. Then hit a problem on day 4. The scrap aluminum supply ran out. The damaged hurricanes they'd been cannibalizing didn't provide enough material for the remaining aircraft. Callaway submitted an emergency requisition for sheet aluminum. The supply officer said it would take 3 days, minimum, to process and receive. Callaway went to Crawford, explained the situation. Crawford called in a favor from another station and had aluminum delivered by truck that evening, but it cost them 4 hours of production time waiting. They completed 3 aircraft on day 4 instead of 4. The schedule was slipping. Day 5 brought different problems. The station engineering officer appeared in the hangar mid-morning. He watched them work for 20 minutes without speaking. His presence was pointed disapproval. He didn't have authority to countermand Briggs' orders, but he could make his opinion known through silence and observation. Callaway ignored him and focused on the work. Davies and Winters were more nervous, making small errors that required correction. They completed 4 aircraft, but the quality control process took longer because Callaway had to verify everything twice. Day 6, 2 aircraft completed by 1600 hours. Then Winters drilled a hole slightly off specification on the 3rd aircraft. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to be wrong. Callaway made him remove the rivet and re-drill. The repair took 2 hours. They finished 3 aircraft total, 1 hour behind schedule. Day 7, 4 aircraft remaining, 12 hours available, 3 man-hours per aircraft if everything went perfectly. No margin for error. They worked through the day without breaking for meals. Davies fabricated braces, while Callaway and Winters installed them. Harper fetched tools and materials. Crawford checked their work periodically, saying nothing but taking notes. The final aircraft was QVS, Rutherford's plane, the one that had experienced severe flutter on October 9th. Callaway saved it for last deliberately. If the modification worked, Rutherford would know the difference immediately. They started the installation at 2100 hours. Drill, deburr, fit, rivet. Callaway's hands moved through the sequence with mechanical precision born from repetition. He was exhausted. They all were. 7 days of 18-hour shifts, working in cold hangars with inadequate light, knowing that one mistake would invalidate everything. The final rivet went in at 2,317 hours on October 20th. Callaway stepped back and examined the installation under torchlight. Davies and Winters stood beside him, swaying slightly from exhaustion. All 18 aircraft now carried the brace. Every installation documented. Every measurement within tolerance. If it worked fleet-wide the way it worked on QVL, the rudder failure rate would drop dramatically. If it didn't work, or if any installation failed, Callaway would face court-martial for endangering pilots, and the entire program would be condemned as reckless disregard for proper procedure. Crawford appeared at 2,330 hours to conduct final inspection. He checked 3 aircraft randomly selected, measured rivet placement, verified structural integrity. His assessment was brief. Work meets quality standards. Aircraft are airworthy. Briggs sent notification to Supermarine Aircraft Company the following morning, a formal technical report describing the problem, the solution, and the field implementation. He attached Crawford's engineering analysis, flight test data from QVL, and incident reports documenting the failure pattern. The message concluded with a request for engineering review and validation. He expected response time measured in weeks. Bureaucracy moves slowly, especially when field modifications challenge factory specifications. But the reply came in 4 days, faster than anyone anticipated. 3 engineers from Supermarine would arrive October 25th to conduct on-site inspection. Speed suggested concern, possibly that a RAF station had implemented unauthorized modifications without consultation. Possibly that Supermarine's engineering team recognized they'd missed a problem that an enlisted mechanic identified. Either way, the company was sending senior personnel to investigate. The lead engineer's name was Robert Henshaw, 52 years old, senior structural engineer who'd worked on Spitfire development since 1936. He'd been part of the team that refined the wing design, solved early stability problems, and validated every major modification implemented during 6 years of production. If anyone understood what the Spitfire could and couldn't do structurally, it was Henshaw. He arrived on a gray Thursday morning with 2 junior engineers in tow. They brought calipers, cameras, measuring equipment, and notebooks. Their expressions were professional skepticism mixed with territorial concern. This was their aircraft, their design. Some sergeant questioning it felt like questioning their competence. Briggs met them personally, offered coffee and briefing on the situation. Henshaw declined both. He wanted to see the modification first, context later. They walked to the flight line where Spitfires sat in their revetments. Henshaw chose QVL, the original test aircraft. He crouched by the tail section and examined the brace with a magnifying glass, ran his fingers along the rivet lines, checked how the reinforcement interfaced with factory structure. His face revealed nothing. He took measurements, had his assistants photograph the installation from multiple angles, asked for maintenance logs showing flight hours and stress history. Then he requested access to a hangar with good light and a workbench. Crawford provided both. Henshaw spent 3 hours with the brace dimensions, running calculations on a clipboard with a slide rule and reference tables. His junior engineers verified the math. They conferred in low voices, pointing at drawings, discussing stress distributions and fatigue life. Finally, Henshaw approached Briggs and Callaway. His expression had shifted from skepticism to something more complicated. "I need to understand the decision process. Who authorized this modification?" Briggs answered, "I did, after engineering review validated the design." "Who designed it?" "Sergeant Callaway." Henshaw turned to Callaway, studying him. "Where did you receive structural engineering training?" "I didn't, sir. I learned through experience maintaining aircraft. You're telling me you designed this modification through practical experience rather than formal education? Yes, sir. I observed failure patterns and developed a solution based on those observations. Henshaw pulled a notebook from his pocket and flipped through pages of calculations. He showed them to Callaway. These are stress analyses for the standard Spitfire rudder assembly under various loading conditions. Can you read them? Callaway looked at the equations. Some were familiar from technical manuals. Others used notation he didn't recognize. He answered honestly, "Some of it, sir. Not all. But you understood the fundamental problem. The aerodynamic loading exceeds structural capacity under high-G maneuvers at speeds the aircraft wasn't originally designed for." Yes, sir. The fabric ripples. The cables stretch. The hinges flex. Eventually something fails. And your solution was to reinforce the hinge assembly to distribute peak loads across a wider structural area. That's correct, sir. Henshaw was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he spoke with the careful precision of someone acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. The modification is sound. More than sound. It's an elegant solution to a problem we should have recognized through our own analysis. When we designed the Spitfire in 1936, combat profiles were different. We optimized for interception missions at moderate speeds and relatively gentle maneuvering. By 1944, pilots are pushing the aircraft far beyond those parameters. We should have updated the structural specifications accordingly. We didn't. You identified the failure mode through empirical observation. Your solution demonstrates sophisticated understanding of load mechanics even if you can't express it in formal engineering language. So the modification is approved? Henshaw's expression hardened. I'll need to present this to the design team at Supermarine, but my recommendation will be approval. Yes, not just approval. We should incorporate a version of this reinforcement into new production models. He paused, then added what came next with deliberate emphasis. However, the way this was implemented violated every protocol we have. If every maintenance fitter started making unsanctioned modifications to address perceived problems, we'd have disaster. There's a reason we require testing, documentation, and approval before changes are implemented. One man's elegant solution could be another man's catastrophic failure. You happen to be right. If you'd been wrong, pilots would be dead, and this aircraft type would be grounded pending investigation. Callaway's voice was steady. I understand that, sir. But pilots were already dead from the original design failing. The protocols you're describing had failed 3 times to address that. Henshaw absorbed the criticism without visible reaction. Then he turned to Briggs. You put yourself in a difficult position, Wing Commander. You authorized field modification without factory approval. If this had failed, your career would be finished. Why take that risk? Because the alternative was watching more pilots die while we waited for approval that might never come. I made a tactical decision based on available evidence and acceptable risk. A tactical decision that undermined the entire structure of aircraft certification and modification control. Briggs's answer was flat, final. Yes, it did. And I'd make the same decision again under the same circumstances. The confrontation lasted 5 seconds of silence. Then Henshaw nodded slowly. I'll include that context in my report. For what it's worth, you made the correct engineering decision. Whether it was the correct command decision is above my authority to judge. He spent another day at Culhead inspecting all 18 modified aircraft. His final verbal assessment to Briggs was delivered in Crawford's presence. All installations meet quality standards. The modification addresses identified failure mode. Recommendation is fleet-wide implementation across all Spitfire Mark 9 aircraft, pending formal approval from Air Ministry. Then he added a personal observation directed at Callaway. You have a gift for seeing what others miss. That gift is valuable, but it's also dangerous if not constrained by process. Remember that. Callaway's response was simple. I'll remember pilots died while I followed process, sir. I'll remember that too. Henshaw left that afternoon. His report reached Supermarine headquarters within 3 days and Air Ministry within a week. The formal approval took another 2 weeks to process through bureaucracy, but by mid-November, fighter squadrons across southern England were receiving technical bulletins authorizing installation of what was now officially designated as Modification 44R7. Rudder hinge reinforcement assembly. The name didn't mention Callaway. The bulletin credited Supermarine Engineering Team with developing the enhancement. But in the technical specification section, buried in notes about installation procedure, one line appeared: field implementation based on maintenance observations by RAF maintenance personnel. 3 squadrons received the modification in November. By December, it was standard retrofit procedure for all operational Spitfire Mark 9 aircraft. Fighter Command's engineering branch tracked the results carefully. The statistics told the story. Before modification implementation, July through October 1944, 11 documented rudder-related incidents across multiple squadrons, 2 fatalities, 4 emergency landings, 5 cases of severe control degradation requiring abort of mission. After modification implementation, November through December 1944, 1 minor incident involving cable tension that was unrelated to the brace, 0 fatalities, 0 emergency landings attributed to rudder failure. Percentage reduction in failure rate, 73%. Estimated lives saved, 9 pilots who would have experienced catastrophic rudder failure based on projected incident rate. Unknown number who avoided problems due to improved structural margin and pilot confidence. The numbers reached Callaway through Crawford, who delivered them without comment. 9 lives, maybe more, saved by 2 pounds of aluminum and 6 rivets installed in secret because proper channels had failed. But the numbers came with cost. On November 15th, Callaway received formal notification that a court of inquiry would convene December 1st at RAF Stanmore to investigate unauthorized modification of combat aircraft. He was ordered to attend. Legal representation would be provided if requested. He declined representation. He'd broken the regulations knowingly. Having a lawyer argue otherwise felt dishonest. He'd stand on the facts. He'd identified a problem, reported it through proper channels, been ignored, made a choice to act anyway. The modification worked. Pilots lived. If that merited court-martial, he'd accept it. Hale came to find him the evening after the notification arrived. They stood in the hangar near QVL while rain drummed on the roof and the smell of wet canvas filled the air. Hale's voice was quiet. "Crawford told me what you did. The modification, the reason my plane flew different." Callaway said nothing. "I flew 19 sorties after you installed that brace. High G combat every time. The controls never failed, never even hesitated. Other pilots weren't so lucky." Still, Callaway remained silent. Hale continued. "Mitchell was my friend. We went through training together. I taught him deflection shooting. He died because his rudder failed. 3 days before you modified my aircraft. If you'd done every plane in September instead of waiting..." "You can't think that way, sir. The past is fixed. Decisions made with information available at the time are the only decisions possible. But you're facing court-martial for saving lives. I'm facing court-martial for violating regulations. The fact that it saved lives might earn leniency. It doesn't erase what I did." Hale's frustration was visible. "This is wrong. You should receive a commendation, not prosecution. The military doesn't work that way, sir. Success doesn't excuse insubordination. Results don't override procedure. Both things matter. Then the system is broken." Callaway's answer was careful, chosen from 12 years of watching how organizations function. "The system prevents disaster 99 times out of 100. This was the 100th time. The exception doesn't invalidate the rule, but it killed Mitchell. The silence that followed held everything they couldn't say. The weight of choices made, the cost of following orders versus breaking them. The impossible calculation of when obedience becomes complicity." Finally, Hale spoke again. "I'll testify at the inquiry. I'll tell them you saved my life. That might make it worse, sir. They don't want to hear that breaking rules produces heroes. They want to hear that rules work and breaking them has consequences. Then what do they want from you?" Callaway looked at the Spitfire they stood beside. QVL, the aircraft that had proven his theory. The physical evidence that sometimes being right requires being wrong. His answer came slowly. "They want me to be sorry. They want remorse for violating chain of command. And they want assurance it won't happen again. Will you give them that?" The question hung between them. Would Callaway lie to protect himself? Would he pretend regret he didn't feel? Would he promise compliance he couldn't guarantee if the same situation emerged? Hale was watching him closely, waiting for answer that mattered beyond this specific moment. Callaway's voice was steady when he finally responded, "I'll tell them the truth, that I knew the regulations, that I violated them deliberately, that I understood the consequences, and that I'd face the same choice again because pilots were dying and proper channels had failed. Whether that's what they want to hear isn't my concern. It's what happened." Hale nodded slowly, then shook his hand, then walked away into the rain. Callaway stood alone in the hangar for another hour. The court of inquiry was 2 weeks away. The outcome would determine whether his career ended in disgrace or something more ambiguous. But the modification was spreading. The failures were stopping. 9 pilots would fly missions they'd otherwise have died in. That had to be enough. Whether it would be enough for the inquiry board was separate question with unknowable answer. He returned to work. There were aircraft to maintain, engines to service, systems to inspect. The war continued regardless of administrative proceedings. Pilots needed planes that flew. Everything else was secondary. The hangar was cold and dark and smelled of oil and metal, the familiar environment of his adult life. This was where he belonged, hands on machinery, solving problems, keeping aircraft alive so pilots could focus on fighting. The court could take that away. Probably would, but they couldn't take what he'd already accomplished. Couldn't erase the brace installed on hundreds of aircraft. Couldn't undo the lives saved. Sometimes you break the rules because the rules are broken. Sometimes you accept consequences because alternative is worse. Sometimes you do what needs doing and let history judge whether it was right. Callaway had made his choice. Now he'd live with it, whatever that meant. December 1st arrived cold and gray. RAF Stanmore occupied requisitioned estate buildings north of London, where administrative proceedings occurred away from operational bases. The Court of Inquiry convened at 0900 hours in a former library with tall windows that let in weak winter light. 3 officers sat behind a table draped in RAF blue, group captain presiding, 2 wing commanders flanking him, an engineering expert from Air Ministry, legal advisor taking notes. Formal inquiry, not criminal trial. The distinction mattered legally if not practically. Callaway wore his dress uniform, creases sharp, brass polished, boots reflecting light. He sat alone at a small table facing the board. No lawyer beside him despite regulations allowing it. He'd chosen to represent himself because having someone argue he hadn't violated orders felt worse than admitting he had. The presiding group captain opened proceedings by reading charges. Unauthorized modification of combat aircraft, disobeying direct order from the superior officer, compromising airworthiness through unsanctioned engineering work. Each charge carried potential for court-martial, reduction in rank, imprisonment. The prosecution case was presented by a squadron leader from RAF legal branch. Young officer, maybe 30, who spoke with rehearsed precision about importance of regulations. His argument was straightforward. Military discipline requires obedience to orders regardless of personal judgment. If every enlisted man made independent decisions about aircraft modification, chaos would result. Safety depends on standardization. Standardization depends on centralized control. Control depends on consequences for violation. The squadron leader presented evidence systematically. Callaway's 3 ignored reports, proof he'd used proper channels initially. The station engineering officer's direct order to cease unauthorized work, proof he'd been explicitly commanded to stop. Documentation showing QVL's modification occurred after that order, proof of deliberate disobedience. Then he addressed the outcome. Yes, the modification worked. Yes, it was subsequently approved. Yes, lives were likely saved. But success doesn't excuse insubordination. If the RAF rewarded rule-breaking when it happened to work, the entire command structure would collapse. Soldiers would decide individually which orders to follow, based on personal assessment of correctness. His conclusion was delivered without emotion. Sergeant Callaway's actions, while well-intentioned, constituted serious violations of military discipline. The board should find him guilty and impose appropriate punishment to preserve order and deter similar future conduct. The prosecution rested. The presiding officer asked Callaway if he understood the charges. Callaway stood and answered clearly, "Yes, sir, I understand them completely." Did he dispute any facts presented by prosecution? No, sir. Everything stated is factually accurate. The board members exchanged glances. Defendants who admitted everything made proceedings simpler, but raised questions about defense strategy. The presiding officer asked what Callaway intended to present in his defense if he acknowledged all charges. Callaway's answer was direct. "I won't dispute what I did, sir. I'll explain why I did it and let the board decide if circumstances provide any mitigation." The group captain nodded. "Proceed." Callaway began with the pattern. 9 Spitfires lost between July and October. He documented every incident, measured every failure, tracked progression of the problem. He described bringing evidence to his flight sergeant, to the station engineering officer, submitting formal reports that were filed and ignored. He explained the physics of the failure, not with equations but with observations any pilot would recognize. The rudder worked beautifully at moderate speeds, but at 400 miles per hour in a high G turn, forces exceeded design parameters. Cables stretched, fabric rippled, hinges flexed beyond tolerance. Eventually, components failed. He testified about Pemberton's death. Watching the rudder separate, hearing the pilot's last transmission, filing the incident report, reading the official conclusion that blamed pilot error when the pilot had done nothing wrong except trust his aircraft. Then he described his choice. Continue submitting reports that would be ignored while more pilots died? Or act on information he knew was correct, even though acting meant violating orders? His voice carried no defiance, no self-righteousness, just statement of logic. "I chose to save lives over following orders I believed were wrong. I accept that this violated regulations. I don't accept that following those regulations was the morally correct choice when men were dying from preventable causes." The board listened without interruption. When Callaway finished, the presiding officer's first question went to the heart of the matter. "Are you arguing that personal judgment supersedes military discipline?" "No, sir. I'm arguing that in this specific case, with this specific evidence, acting on that judgment was necessary because the system designed to prevent deaths had failed. I'm not claiming general authority to disobey orders. I'm claiming that when proper channels fail and lives are at stake, and you have the solution, doing nothing becomes complicity. Even if doing something means court-martial?" Callaway's answer came without hesitation. "Yes, sir. Even then." The board moved to witness testimony. First was the station engineering officer from Culhead. He entered wearing expression of vindicated displeasure. This was his opportunity to be proven right about procedure mattering more than results. The prosecution asked him to describe his interactions with Callaway. The SCO testified methodically. 3 meetings where Callaway brought concerns about rudder integrity. Each time the SCO had assessed the evidence and determined it didn't meet threshold for emergency action. Pattern of wear, yes, but within acceptable parameters for aircraft under combat stress. He described ordering Callaway to cease unauthorized work. Clear, direct command. No ambiguity. Sergeant was told explicitly that any modifications required proper authorization through official channels. Did Callaway acknowledge the order? Yes. He acknowledged it and agreed to comply. And yet he violated it anyway? Yes. He installed the modification despite being ordered not to. The SEO's voice carried conviction when he delivered his conclusion. Sergeant Callaway may believe he acted for correct reasons, but if we allow enlisted personnel to decide which orders to follow based on personal judgment, we destroy the discipline that keeps this service functioning. He was wrong to disobey. The fact that his modification worked is irrelevant to that fundamental violation. Callaway was given opportunity to cross-examine. He had one question. If you'd approved my request for technical inquiry in September, how many pilots might be alive today who aren't? The SEO's face tightened. That's speculation and inappropriate. Is it? Mitchell died October 3rd. My modification was installed September 28th on one aircraft. If you'd authorized fleet-wide implementation when I first requested it, would Mitchell have had a reinforced rudder? Objection from prosecution about hypothetical scenarios. The presiding officer sustained it, but the question had been asked. The board had heard it. That was Callaway's only goal. Next witness was Wing Commander Briggs. He testified about receiving the inspection report showing 11 aircraft with problems and one mysteriously perfect. About confronting Callaway and getting the confession. About making the tactical decision to authorize immediate implementation despite lack of official approval. The prosecution asked why he'd taken that risk. Briggs's answer was blunt, because the alternative was watching more pilots die while we waited weeks for Supermarine to process approval that might never come. I had evidence the modification worked. I had opportunity to implement it immediately. I made command decision based on available information. And if it had failed, if the modification had caused catastrophic failure, then I'd be facing court-martial alongside Sergeant Callaway, and deservedly so. Command means accepting responsibility for decisions. I authorize the work. I own the outcome. But you're not facing charges. Why is Sergeant Callaway being prosecuted while you're not? Briggs's expression hardened. Because I had authority to authorize field modifications as squadron commander. He didn't. The same action performed at different levels of command carries different implications. That's how military hierarchy functions. The board asked Briggs for his assessment of Callaway's character and competence. Briggs answered carefully. Sergeant Callaway is the most skilled airframe fitter I've worked with in 6 years of commanding maintenance crews. His technical knowledge exceeds most commissioned engineers I've met. His dedication to pilot safety is absolute. He violated orders, yes, but he did so after exhausting proper channels and watching men die from a problem he knew how to fix. That doesn't excuse the violation. It does provide context the board should consider. Squadron leader Marcus Hale testified next. 24 years old now, promoted since October. Still flying Spitfires, though the war was winding down and missions were fewer, targets scarcer. He described 19 combat sorties flown after September 28th, when Callaway installed the modification. High-G maneuvers in every engagement. The kind of flying that had killed Pemberton, nearly killed Garrett, caused Rutherford's emergency landing. But QVL's controls never failed, never hesitated, responded perfectly every time. The prosecution asked if he'd known about the modification. Hale's answer was honest. No, not until Crawford's inspection in October. Sergeant Callaway never told me. Why not? Why keep it secret from the pilot flying the aircraft? Hale's answer came slowly, clearly. Because if he'd told me, I would have been obligated to report it. The modification would have been removed before testing. Callaway understood that. He kept me ignorant to protect me and to protect the test. The board asked about Pemberton. Hale's voice went flat when he described watching his wingman die. The rudder separating. The spin. The impact. Then finding out 3 days later that Callaway had identified the problem and been told to stop working on solutions. His final statement was delivered with careful control. I'm alive because Sergeant Callaway broke regulations. Mitchell is dead because those regulations were followed. I understand the board must enforce discipline, but I also understand that I'm sitting here breathing because someone chose to do what was right instead of what was ordered. Robert Henshaw from Supermarine testified via written deposition since he couldn't travel from the factory. His statement was read aloud by the legal advisor. Henshaw confirmed the modification was structurally sound and demonstrated sophisticated engineering understanding. He acknowledged that Supermarine should have identified the problem through their own analysis, but hadn't. He noted that the rudder assembly had been optimized for 1938 combat profiles and that operational use had evolved beyond original specifications. Then came his critical assessment. The modification addresses a real failure mode that was killing pilots. Implementation was necessary. However, the method of implementation violated essential protocols that exist to prevent disasters. One man's correct solution could have been another man's catastrophic mistake. The fact that Sergeant Callaway was right doesn't change the fundamental problem with unsanctioned modifications. His recommendation was ambiguous. The board should recognize both that the modification saved lives and that the process was inappropriate. How to balance those competing factors is beyond my engineering expertise. The testimony phase concluded at 1500 hours. The board recessed to deliberate. Callaway waited in an adjacent room with a cup of tea that went cold while he stared at nothing and calculated probabilities. Court-martial meant discharge. Probably dishonorable given the nature of charges. Loss of pension, Civilian life with military career ended in disgrace. But 9 pilots were flying who wouldn't be if he'd done nothing. That had to matter more than his future. 6 hours passed. Darkness fell outside the tall windows. Someone brought him dinner he didn't eat. At 2130 hours, the runner appeared and told him the board had reached decision. The library had been lit with electric lamps that created harsh shadows. Callaway stood at attention before the table, where 3 officers sat with papers arrayed in front of them. The presiding group captain's face revealed nothing. The announcement came with formal precision. This board has carefully considered all evidence and testimony presented. We make the following findings. Regarding charge of unauthorized modification of combat aircraft, guilty. Regarding charge of disobeying direct order from the superior officer, guilty. However, this board acknowledges extenuating circumstances that must be considered in determining appropriate consequences. The group captain continued, reading from prepared statement. Sergeant Callaway's actions, while violations of regulation, were motivated by genuine concern for pilot safety and vindicated by results. The modification he designed and implemented has been validated by supermarine engineering and authorized for fleet-wide implementation. Statistical evidence demonstrates significant reduction in rudder-related incidents following its adoption. Lives were saved, but the process by which this occurred undermined the chain of command and modification control procedures that exist to ensure safety and standardization. If every maintenance fitter began making independent engineering decisions without authorization, the results would be catastrophic. Military discipline requires consequences for disobedience regardless of outcome. This board therefore imposes the following sentence. Official reprimand to be entered in service record. Sergeant Callaway will complete formal engineering protocols course to ensure understanding of proper procedures. No reduction in rank, no confinement, no discharge. The presiding officer looked directly at Callaway, and his next words carried weight beyond their simple delivery. This board finds you were wrong to bypass regulations, but right in your assessment and solution. You saved lives through insubordination. We cannot condone that precedent, but neither can we ignore that outcome. Military discipline requires punishment. Military pragmatism requires we not destroy the man who solved a problem we failed to see. You will carry a reprimand. You will also carry the thanks of 9 pilots who lived because you acted. Callaway absorbed the verdict, guilty but not destroyed, punished but not broken. The paradox was perfect summary of everything this case represented, right and wrong existing simultaneously without resolution. The group captain wasn't finished. One final statement for this record. This case demonstrates both the value of individual initiative and the danger of undermining institutional control. The balance between those competing concerns cannot be codified. It must be judged case by case based on circumstances and outcomes. This board hopes never to face similar circumstances again. If we do, we hope the person facing that choice has Sergeant Callaway's competence and accepts similar consequences. Court adjourned at 2147 hours December 1st. Callaway walked out into cold night air, carrying a reprimand in his freedom. The war would end in 5 months. He'd remain in service until then, maintaining aircraft with the same precision he'd always brought to the work. But something had shifted, not in his dedication or skill, in how others treated him. Respect mixed with caution, acknowledgement of expertise combined with awareness that this was a man who'd broken rules and survived. That combination created distance even from those who supported what he'd done. January through May 1945. The war ground toward conclusion. Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Soviet armies closed from the east. The Luftwaffe was shadows of its former strength, fuel scarce, experienced pilots scarcer. Missions became less frequent as targets disappeared and victory became inevitable. Callaway continued his work. The brace was now standard equipment. New production Spitfires rolled off assembly lines with integrated reinforcement designed by supermarine engineers based on his field modification. Modification 44R7 spread to squadrons across fighter command. By March, 347 Spitfire Mark 9s carried it. The incident reports told clear story. November through April. One rudder-related problem documented across entire fleet. Cable tension issue unrelated to the brace, fixed during routine maintenance. 0 failures, 0 fatalities, 0 emergency landings caused by control surface separation. Flight Lieutenant Hale flew his final combat sortie April 29th. Escort mission over Germany. No enemy contact. He landed at Culhead and climbed out of QVL for the last time. The war in Europe would end 9 days later. Hale would be promoted to wing commander and assigned training command. He'd never forget the Spitfire that kept him alive through 51 combat sorties after September 28th. May 8th, victory in Europe declared. Aircraft that had been instruments of war became artifacts of history overnight. Bases that hummed with urgency grew quiet. Pilots and ground crews waited for demobilization orders while peace settled over England like snow. Welcome and disorienting. Callaway received his discharge notice in November. 14 years service. Specialist rating. Honorable discharge despite the reprimand in his record. Standard demobilization pay, civilian suit, train ticket home to Coventry. He left RAF Culhead on a Tuesday morning in January 1946. Age 32. No ceremony, no speeches. Just handshakes from men he'd worked beside, and a long walk to the station carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag. The train passed through countryside recovering from 6 years of war. Airfields being dismantled, factories converting to civilian production, cities still showing bomb damage. England was exhausted and victorious and trying to remember what peace felt like. Coventry looked worse than Callaway remembered. The November 1940 Blitz had gutted the city center. Rebuilding was underway, but progress came slowly, with resources scarce and priorities uncertain. His father's shop had survived by luck. Wrong street for the German targeting that night. The building stood intact among ruins. The shop was dark when Callaway arrived. His father had died in 1943. Heart attack while working at the lathe. The equipment remained: metal lathes, milling machines, hand tools hanging on pegboards, workbenches scarred by decades of use. But no orders pending, no work scheduled. Just empty space waiting for someone to decide its future. Callaway decided. He used his demobilization pay to purchase updated equipment and materials. Restarted the business making precision parts. First for textile looms like his father had, then expanding to early automobile components as that industry grew. Small operation, never more than 3 employees, but steady income providing respectable living. He met Helen Wright in 1947. She was 28, nurse at Coventry Hospital. They encountered each other at a market where he was buying vegetables and she was buying bread, and their hands reached for the same item simultaneously. Conversation followed, then tea. Then regular meetings that evolved into courtship. She asked about the war once. They were walking along the canal on a Sunday afternoon. "What did you do in the RAF?" His answer was simple: kept planes flying. She waited for elaboration that never came. She learned not to ask. They married October 1948 in a small ceremony at the parish church. Her family attended. His was just him. They bought a modest house outside the city center where bomb damage was less severe. Started building the quiet life that soldiers dream about during war, but find strange when actually achieved. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born 1949. Second daughter, Elizabeth, in 1952. Callaway was methodical father. Taught them precision, patience, how to measure twice and cut once, how to read technical drawings, how to understand that quality of work mattered more than speed of completion. He never told them war stories. When Margaret asked as a teenager why he didn't talk about his service, his answer was characteristic. Because the work speaks for itself, the talking doesn't add anything. The shop became known for reliability. If Callaway made it, it wouldn't break. Orders were steady if not spectacular. He employed local men who needed work, trained them properly, paid fair wages, built reputation based on craftsmanship rather than marketing. February 1963. A journalist named David Patterson appeared at the shop unannounced. He was 35, working for Aviation magazine, researching article about unsung engineering innovations during the war. He'd found references to modification 44R7 in RAF technical archives. Found Callaway's name buried in maintenance bulletins and court proceedings, tracked him to Coventry through service records. Patterson introduced himself while Callaway was working at the lathe, explained his project, said he wanted to interview the man who'd developed the Spitfire rudder modification that saved lives. Callaway shut down the machine and looked at him. That was long time ago, but it mattered. At least 9 pilots according to records I've found. Possibly more. Don't you think people should know that story? The story is in the technical manuals. Anyone interested can read those. Patterson tried different approach. What made you decide to install that first brace without authorization? Weren't you afraid of consequences? Fear of consequences is a luxury. In 1944, pilots were dying. I had solution. The choice was simple. But you violated regulations. You could have been court-martialed. Could have been. Wasn't. Pilots lived. That's the story. Patterson's frustration was visible. Surely there's more to it. The investigation, the hearing, the bureaucratic battle. Callaway returned to his work, turning the lathe back on. You want story about fighting the system. That's not what it was. It was maintenance. I saw a problem. I fixed it. That's all. The journalist raised his voice over the machine noise. Mr. Callaway, with respect, that's not just maintenance. You changed RAF policy. Your design is still in technical manuals 20 years later. Then the manuals tell the story. I don't need to, Patterson persisted. But don't you think people should know? The pilots you saved, they have families. Those families exist because of your... Callaway shut off the lathe and interrupted. Those families exist because their husbands and fathers flew well and got lucky. I kept their planes working. That was my job. You're being too modest. This was more than routine maintenance. You saw something no one else. I'm being accurate. You want heroes? Talk to pilots who flew through flak. Talk to mechanics who patch bullet holes in 20-hour shifts. Don't make me something I'm not. What are you then? The question hung between them. Patterson waiting for answer that would make his article. Callaway considering how to explain what couldn't really be explained to someone who hadn't lived it. His answer came measured. A man who did what needed doing. Nothing more. Patterson tried several more approaches. Offered payment for on-record interview. Callaway refused. Offered to feature him prominently in the article. Callaway declined. Finally asked one last question. Do you regret it? Any of it? The violation? The risk you took? Callaway's answer was the same one he'd given the station engineering officer 20 years earlier. Regret is luxury. I didn't have time for it in 1944. Don't see the point now. Patterson left frustrated. His article published 3 months later in Specialized Aviation Journal. It mentioned modification 44R7 and its impact on Spitfire reliability. One paragraph near the end noted, field implementation was pioneered by RAF maintenance personnel, including Sergeant E. Callaway, who declined interview for this piece. That was the extent of Callaway's public recognition. One paragraph in a magazine most people never read. He retired from the shop in 1972 at age 59, sold the business to longtime employee who'd worked beside him for 15 years. The sale provided modest income to supplement the small RAF pension that came with his honorable discharge. Retirement was quiet, garden behind the house, woodworking in the garage, long walks with Helen, visits from daughters and eventually grandchildren who called him strict but fair and never understood why he wouldn't fly even on commercial aircraft. In 1977, a historian researching Spitfire engineering wrote to squadron leader Marcus Hale, now retired and living in Sussex. The historian was compiling detailed technical history of various modifications implemented during the war. Hale's response included long passage about Callaway. He described him as quiet, methodical, stubborn. Said Callaway never talked about what he'd done, just did it and moved on to next problem. Wrote that the war was full of people like that, people whose names never made history books, but whose fingerprints were all over the machines that won. The historian contacted Callaway requesting verification and additional details. Callaway responded by post, brief letter confirming basic facts, declining interview, noting that the technical specifications were publicly available and contained everything worth knowing about the modification. The historian's book, published in 1979, included 2 pages about modification 44R7. Credited Supermarine Engineering Team primarily, mentioned field implementation by RAF personnel and subordinate clause, included Callaway's name and footnote. Callaway never saw the book. He died March 1979 at age 66. Heart attack at home. Quick. Helen found him in the garage where he'd been working on a table for Elizabeth's house. The table was nearly finished, just needed sanding and varnish. Elizabeth completed it herself, using techniques he'd taught her. The funeral was small, family and few friends. No military honors because family didn't request them. The RAF sent standard condolence letter acknowledging his service. Nothing special. Standard form used for all deceased veterans. Coventry Telegraph obituary ran March 14th. Eric Callaway, 66, retired toolmaker. Served in RAF 1932-1946 as airframe fitter. Survived by wife Helen, daughters Margaret and Elizabeth, 4 grandchildren. Services were held Tuesday at Holy Trinity Church. In lieu of flowers, donations to the Royal British Legion. 48 words. No mention of the modification. No mention of 9 pilots. No mention of quiet defiance that turned observation into fleet-wide standard. But the brace endures. RAF Museum, Hendon displays a restored Spitfire Mark 9. Tail number QVL. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Hale's aircraft. Small placard beside it notes various technical specifications. One line mentions field modification to rudder assembly implemented 1944. Technical manuals archived at the museum library contain detailed drawings. Specification number 44, R7. Installation procedures. Quality control requirements. In the notes section, buried among lists of torque values and inspection intervals, one line appears. Based on field implementation by RAF maintenance personnel, October 1944. Aviation historians know about the modification. Restoration projects reference it when rebuilding Spitfires to authentic configuration. Technical discussions among enthusiasts occasionally mention the sergeant who installed it first without permission and nearly got court-martialed for saving lives. But casual museum visitors don't see that history. They see a beautiful aircraft, sleek lines, elliptical wings, the fighter that saved Britain. They don't see the 2 pounds of aluminum riveted to the rudder. Don't see the 4 hours of careful work performed by torchlight. Don't see the choice made between orders and conscience. The deeper truth is that wars are told as stories of great men and machines. Churchill's speeches, Eisenhower's strategy, the Spitfire's graceful power. History compresses complexity into narratives people can remember. Heroes and villains, victories and defeats. Moments that changed everything. But wars aren't won by single moments. They're won by thousands small decisions made by people whose names fade. Maintenance crews working through cold nights, engineers calculating stress loads, fitters drilling rivets that must be perfect because imperfection means death. Eric Callaway was one of those people. Not commander who gave orders, not pilot who pressed attacks, not designer who drew blueprints. The man who saw a problem and refused to accept it as inevitable. Organizations need rules to function. Hierarchies exist for reasons. Procedures prevent chaos. All of that is true and necessary, but rules sometimes lag reality. Hierarchies sometimes block solutions. Procedures sometimes kill people they're designed to protect. Someone has to bridge that gap. Someone has to look at the gap between what regulations say and what physics demands and choose which one matters more. That choice requires competence to see the problem clearly and courage to act despite consequences. Callaway had both. He saw what university-educated engineers missed. He acted when proper channels failed. He accepted the court-martial risk because alternative was watching more pilots die. The system punished him for it. Reprimand on his record. Career trajectory limited. No commendations. No recognition beyond technical bulletins. The system also used his solution, implemented it fleet-wide, saved lives with it, incorporated it into production, then quietly erased his name from the story because acknowledging him would validate rule-breaking, and organizations can't do that without undermining their own authority. That paradox never resolves. Callaway was right about the problem and right about the solution, but wrong about the method. Both statements are true. Neither cancels the other. The tension between them is where actual ethics lives, not in abstract principles, but in specific moments requiring impossible choices. When the rules are wrong and lives are at stake, and you have the solution, What do you do? Follow regulations and watch people die? Break regulations and face consequences? There's no answer that satisfies both discipline and morality. Callaway chose morality and accepted discipline's punishment. That choice defined him more than any medal could have. He didn't need recognition, didn't seek it, didn't want it. The work was the reward. The pilot's living was the validation. Everything else was noise. His legacy isn't monument or medal. It's piece of aluminum still specified in restoration manuals. It's statistical reduction in failure rates documented in engineering reports. It's 9 pilots who flew missions they'd otherwise have died in, and their children who exist because rudders didn't fail, and the ripples spreading forward through time from that choice made in a cold hangar by torchlight. History remembers the Spitfire. History forgets the sergeant who kept them flying. That imbalance is how history works. The machines get preserved. The men who maintain them fade into footnotes and eventually nothing. But occasionally someone digs through archives and finds the story, finds the name, finds the choice made between obedience and survival. And for a moment, the man who worked in darkness steps back into light, not as hero. Callaway would have rejected that framing, as craftsman who understood tolerances mattered, as mechanic who knew what breaks and why, as human who saw problem and refused to accept that fixing it was someone else's responsibility. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is ignore the order and fix the problem anyway. Not because you're brave, because people are dying and you have the solution, and waiting for permission means accepting deaths you could have prevented. That's what Eric Callaway understood at age 31, standing in a hangar at midnight. Rules existed. He'd followed them. They'd failed. Now he had to choose between continuing to follow failed rules or breaking them to solve the problem they should have addressed. He chose to act. He chose to accept consequences. He chose competence over compliance and lived with the cost. His name appears in footnotes if it appears at all, but his fingerprints are on the machines that won. His choice saved lives that created families that spread through generations. His refusal to accept that this is how things are done, as answer to people are dying, matters more than any recognition the system could have given him. Because in the end, what matters isn't whether history remembers. What matters is whether you did what needed doing when it needed doing. Whether you saw clearly and acted correctly despite pressure to do neither. Eric Callaway did both. The brace proves it. The lives saved prove it. The quiet way he lived afterward, never seeking credit, never regretting the choice, proves it most of all. He was a man who saw what needed fixing and fixed it. Who broke the rules because the rules were broken. Who understood that sometimes being right means being wrong by every official measure. That's the story. That's the legacy. Not monuments or medals, but the simple fact that when facing impossible choice between orders and conscience, between procedure and survival, between compliance and competence, he chose correctly. And 9 pilots lived because of it. Maybe more. The exact number is unknowable. How do you count the accidents that didn't happen? The crashes that never came? The names that stayed off casualty lists because a sergeant decided that being right mattered more than being obedient? You can't count them. You can only acknowledge that they exist. That Eric Callaway's choice to act without permission created futures that otherwise wouldn't have been. That his refusal to accept wait for approval as answer while pilots died made real measurable difference. The war ended. The planes were retired. The men went home. Most names faded, but the work remained. The modification remained. The lives saved remained. And somewhere in an archive, in a technical manual, in a restoration specification, the evidence remains that once a sergeant with grease on his hands and conviction in his gut looked at a problem everyone else accepted and said no. Not acceptable, not inevitable, fixable, then fixed it, despite orders, despite consequences, despite everything except the simple moral calculus that pilots dying when you know how to prevent it is worse than any punishment military discipline can impose. That's the kind of courage no medal recognizes. The kind of heroism no speech captures. The kind of legacy that matters more than any official history. Eric Callaway, age 31 to 66, toolmaker's son, RAF airframe fitter,